Case 1. Michelle Paet. The morning of the 1st of December 2010 in Clark County, Nevada, began like any other for a household on the outskirts of Las Vegas. Nathan Paet, a staff sergeant with the United States Air Force, was preparing for a graveyard shift, the kind of overnight assignment military families learn to build their lives around. His wife, Michelle Paet, moved through the house that night with a secret pressing against every quiet word she spoke to him. What looked like an ordinary goodbye between a service member and his spouse was, investigators would later determine, the final signal in a plot that had been assembled with chilling patience. As Nathan gathered his things, Michelle sent a text message to a man named Michael Rodriguez, a man she had been carrying on a relationship with in secret. The message was brief, almost mundane in its wording, but it carried enormous weight. It told Rodriguez that Nathan was about to leave for work. That single message was the trigger for everything that followed. Rodriguez was not alone. He had recruited an accomplice, a man named Corey Hawkins, and together the two men positioned themselves near the garage of the home Nathan shared with his wife. When Nathan stepped out to begin his shift, the two men were waiting. Nathan was struck by gunfire 5 times in his own garage, a place that should have represented nothing more than the ordinary threshold between a family home and the outside world. He collapsed inside the house, and despite the desperate effort of first responders, he did not survive his injuries. For investigators, the scene raised questions from the very beginning. There was no clear forced entry, no signs of a robbery gone wrong, no obvious stranger with an obvious motive. The picture that slowly emerged was something far more devastating than a random act of violence. This was a targeted plan, orchestrated from the inside, by someone Nathan trusted with his entire life. As detectives began peeling back the layers of the Paet household, they uncovered a portrait of deception that had been building for months. Michelle Paet had been living a double life, one as the wife of a decorated Air Force staff sergeant, and another as a woman entangled in a secret relationship that would ultimately cost her husband everything. Investigators traced the digital footprint of her communications with Rodriguez, uncovering a trail of messages that painted a picture of calculation rather than passion. This was not a crime of a single reckless moment. This was something built, piece by piece over time. At the center of the entire scheme sat something painfully ordinary in its motivation: money. Nathan Paet, as a member of the United States military, carried a life insurance policy valued at $650,000. For Michelle, prosecutors would later argue, that policy represented an opportunity. It represented a payout large enough to build an entirely new life, one unburdened by a marriage she had already emotionally abandoned. What made the case especially painful for the community and for Nathan's fellow service members was the exploitation of the very system designed to protect military families in the event of the ultimate sacrifice. Instead of providing security to a grieving widow, that policy became, in the eyes of investigators, the very reason for Nathan's death. The case moved through the legal system for years, a long and grinding process that tested the patience of everyone connected to Nathan's memory. Investigators built their case methodically, piecing together phone records, witness statements, and the eventual cooperation of those involved in carrying out the plan. Prosecutors ultimately determined they had enough evidence to seek the harshest possible consequences under Nevada law, including the potential for the death penalty. Faced with that reality, Michelle Paet made a decision. Rather than proceed to a trial where a jury might have handed down the most severe sentence available, she entered a guilty plea. In October of 2015, nearly 5 years after the crime that ended her husband's life, Michelle Paet pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy. The plea allowed her to avoid a possible death sentence, but it did not allow her to avoid a lifetime behind bars. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured she would never again walk free in the community she once called home. For Nathan Paet's family, and for the extended family of military service members who understood exactly what he represented, the sentence closed one chapter of an unbearable ordeal, even as it opened a permanent wound that could never fully heal. Nathan served his country with honor, only to lose his life in the one place that should have always been safe, his own home, at the hands of the person who had promised to build a life alongside him. Cases like this one carry a lesson that reaches far beyond the borders of Clark County. They remind us of the importance of awareness among military families, many of whom rely on life insurance and survivor benefits as a foundation of long-term security. Organizations such as the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, known as TAPS, exist specifically to help military families navigate the aftermath of an unexpected loss, offering grief support and community connection to spouses and children left behind by tragedy. If you or someone you know has been affected by the loss of a service member, resources like TAPS are available to help carry that weight. Justice, in the case of Nathan Paet, came slowly, but it came. And in telling his story, we honor not the woman who orchestrated his death, but the memory of a man who wore his country's uniform and deserved so much better than the betrayal that ended his life far too soon. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Brandy Stutzman. On the 7th of November 2010, in Clark County, Nevada, a marriage that had already been unraveling for months reached its final, devastating conclusion. Joe Stutzman, a man in the process of separating from his wife, Brandy Stutzman, went to sleep that night with no idea that his own home had already become the staging ground for a plan designed to end his life. To understand how that night unfolded, investigators had to look backward into the weeks and months that preceded it. What they found was a disturbing pattern of manipulation, one that reached far beyond the marriage itself, and pulled in a group of vulnerable young people who had no real understanding of what they were being drawn into. Brandy Stutzman, prosecutors would later argue, had spent considerable time cultivating relationships with local teenagers, offering them drugs and alcohol, creating a dynamic of dependency and loyalty that she could later exploit. Among this group was a 19-year-old named Jeremiah Merriweather, a young man who had developed an intense fixation on Brandy. Investigators described his devotion to her as something Brandy recognized early on and chose to use to her advantage. Rather than confronting her estranged husband directly or pursuing the difficult but lawful process of separation and divorce, Brandy allegedly turned to manipulation as her instrument of choice. She groomed Jeremiah over time, feeding both his infatuation with her and his access to substances that clouded his judgment, until he had been shaped into someone willing to carry out an unthinkable act on her behalf. On the night in question, prosecutors say Brandy helped dress Jeremiah in a hooded sweatshirt and a hockey mask, an outfit designed to obscure his identity and distance the crime from its true architect. Jeremiah entered the home where Joe Stutzman lay sleeping, unaware of the fate awaiting him. He was attacked with a knife, struck 15 times in an assault so severe that investigators described it as one of the most disturbing scenes they had encountered in their careers. Joe did not survive the attack. For a period of time following the crime, the true nature of what had happened remained hidden, buried beneath a scene that seemed to suggest a random, senseless act of violence. But investigators refused to let the story end there. Piece by piece, detectives began connecting the threads. Jeremiah's obsession with Brandy, the drugs and alcohol that had flowed freely among the group of teenagers she surrounded herself with, and the financial incentives that stood to benefit Brandy the moment her husband was gone. At the heart of the plan, prosecutors argued, sat 2 familiar motivations: money and property. Joe Stutzman carried a life insurance policy worth $213,000, a payout that would fall directly into Brandy's hands the moment he was declared deceased. Beyond the insurance policy, his death would also grant her sole ownership of property the couple had shared, eliminating the messy and often costly process of a divorce settlement. For Brandy, prosecutors alleged, ending her husband's life was simply the most efficient path to a financial outcome she had already decided she wanted. The investigation and subsequent prosecution took years to reach its conclusion, a process complicated by the number of people involved and the disturbing nature of how a legal adult had been manipulated into carrying out the plan of an older woman he trusted completely. Unlike some cases that end in a negotiated plea, Brandy Stutzman's case proceeded all the way to a jury trial. In 2017, that jury reviewed the mountain of evidence prosecutors had assembled, the digital communications, the testimony of those who had witnessed her cultivate relationships with vulnerable teenagers, and the timeline connecting her actions directly to the events of that November night. The jury convicted Brandy Stutzman of first-degree murder. The court handed down its sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the woman who had orchestrated her husband's death and who had exploited the vulnerability of a teenager to do it would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. For Joe Stutzman's family, the guilty verdict offered a measure of closure after years of uncertainty, though nothing could undo the loss of a man whose life was cut short by someone he had once built a future with. And for the community surrounding Jeremiah Merriweather, the case served as a sobering reminder of how easily a young person's vulnerabilities, an infatuation, an unstable home life, an introduction to substances can be weaponized by an adult determined to use them for their own ends. This case underscores the importance of recognizing manipulation and coercive influence, particularly when it involves young people who may not yet have the life experience to recognize when they are being used. Organizations such as the National Center for Victims of Crime offer resources and support not only for victims of violent crime, but for families trying to understand and recover from the ripple effects that cases like this one leave behind. If this story resonates with you or someone in your life, know that support and guidance are available. Joe Stutzman deserved a future far removed from the one his estranged wife chose to orchestrate. In remembering his story, we honor the life that was taken from him, and we recognize the accountability that a Nevada jury ultimately delivered. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Krystal Whipple. December 29, 2018. Clark County, Nevada. In the days leading up to the last week of December 2018, the city of Las Vegas moved through its usual rhythm, locals running errands, tourists filling the strip, small businesses managing the steady hum of holiday traffic. Tucked away from the glittering casinos, an ordinary nail salon prepared for another day of everyday commerce, unaware that within its walls an encounter was about to unfold that would end with unimaginable loss for one of its most dedicated employees. Inu Ngokwin, known affectionately to friends and clients as Annie, had spent years building a reputation as a warm, hard-working presence at the salon. At 51 years old, she had become something of an anchor for the business, the kind of manager customers trusted and co-workers relied on. On this particular afternoon, a woman named Krystal Whipple walked through the salon doors seeking a manicure, a routine, unremarkable request that should have ended with nothing more than freshly painted nails and a receipt. Instead, what began as a $35 transaction quickly spiraled into something far more consequential. When it came time to pay, Whipple attempted to use a credit card that, according to investigators, was fraudulent. Annie, following standard procedure, likely raised concerns about the payment. Whipple, thinking quickly, told Annie she needed to step outside to retrieve cash to cover the cost of her service. What followed next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but it would leave a permanent scar on everyone who witnessed it. Rather than returning with payment, Whipple made her way to a stolen rental vehicle, a Chevrolet Camaro that did not belong to her, and prepared to drive away without ever settling her bill. Annie, sensing something was deeply wrong, ran toward the vehicle in an attempt to stop her from leaving. What should have been a simple dispute over an unpaid manicure turned catastrophic in an instant. Rather than stopping, Whipple accelerated the vehicle directly into Annie's path. The impact was devastating, and in the chaos that followed, Annie's body was dragged across the pavement as the car continued forward before speeding away from the scene entirely. Bystanders and salon employees rushed to Annie's side, but the injuries she sustained were beyond what any immediate intervention could reverse. Annie did not survive the encounter, a devoted mother, co-worker and pillar of her community, taken from the people who loved her over what amounted to a $35 service and a fraudulent piece of plastic. In the hours that followed, law enforcement scrambled to piece together the identity of the driver who had fled the scene. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and the salon's own payment records began painting a clear picture of who they were looking for. But by the time investigators connected the dots, Krystal Whipple was already far beyond the borders of Nevada. Whipple's flight took her across state lines, evading capture for a period of time that only deepened the anguish felt by Annie's family and the broader Las Vegas community demanding accountability. Eventually, law enforcement tracked her to Phoenix, Arizona, where she was taken into custody and returned to Nevada to face the consequences of what she had done. Facing overwhelming evidence, Whipple ultimately entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder rather than proceed to a lengthy jury trial. In 2021, a Clark County judge handed down her sentence, a term of 10 to 25 years in prison, a sentence intended to reflect both the severity of her actions and the acknowledgement that she had ultimately accepted responsibility rather than continuing to evade justice. For the family Annie left behind, no sentence could ever undo the loss of a woman who spent her final moments simply trying to hold someone accountable for a transaction gone wrong. Her story is a sobering reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can turn irreversible, and how a small act of dishonesty, left unchecked, can spiral into consequences no one could have predicted. Local victim advocacy organizations, including Nevada's own Crime Victims Center, continue to provide support for families of homicide victims navigating the long road toward healing, offering both counseling and guidance through the legal process that follows an unimaginable loss. Annie Wynn's memory lives on through the community she served for years, a woman whose warmth and dedication should be remembered far more than the tragic circumstances of her final day. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 4. Brookey Lee West. Committed in mid-1993, discovered by police in February of 2001, Clark County, Nevada. For nearly 8 years, a secret sat buried in the Nevada desert, hidden inside a nondescript storage unit that gave no outward indication of the devastating truth contained within. It would take the persistence of law enforcement and the eventual unraveling of a carefully maintained lie to finally bring that truth into the light. At the center of the deception was Brookey Lee West, a woman who, in the middle of 1993, made the decision to end the life of her own 62-year-old mother, Christine Smith. According to investigators, West used physical force to end her mother's life inside their shared living space, a betrayal made all the more disturbing by the relationship between the two women. Rather than reporting what had happened, West chose an entirely different path. She placed her mother's remains inside a garbage container, surrounding it with books focused on satanic themes and ordinary household trash, an unsettling attempt to obscure what she had done. She then transported this container to a storage facility in the Las Vegas desert, tucking it away inside a plastic storage bin where it would remain concealed for years. What makes this case especially chilling is not simply the concealment itself, but the sustained deception West maintained in the years that followed. Rather than acknowledging her mother's passing, West continued to present the illusion that Christine Smith was still alive. This elaborate ruse served a very specific financial purpose. As long as authorities believed Christine was living, her Social Security benefits continued to be issued, and West continued to collect and cash those checks for herself, month after month, year after year. The deception continued for nearly 8 years before investigators finally uncovered the truth. In February of 2001, law enforcement located the storage unit and discovered the remains that had been hidden away for so long. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and immediately raised additional, deeply troubling questions about West's history. During the course of the investigation, detectives learned that West had also been connected, though never formally charged, to the unexplained disappearances of both her husband and her brother. While these earlier disappearances were never definitively proven to be connected to any wrongdoing on West's part, the pattern raised significant concern among investigators who had spent years trying to understand the full scope of what West may have been capable of. The case against West for the death of her mother, however, moved forward with far greater certainty. Prosecutors presented their evidence, and in 2001, a jury convicted Brookey Lee West of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would ultimately define the remainder of her life. West passed away in a Nevada correctional facility in 2020, having spent nearly 2 decades behind bars for a crime she had hidden for almost as long as she managed to conceal it. This case stands as a stark reminder of how financial motivations can drive individuals to unthinkable lengths, and how the exploitation of a vulnerable family member, even after their passing, represents a profound violation of trust. It also highlights the importance of continued vigilance among neighbors, extended family, and community members who may notice inconsistencies in an elderly person's well-being or sudden isolation from the outside world. Adult protective services organizations across Nevada continue to encourage community members to report concerns about the welfare of elderly individuals, recognizing that early intervention can prevent tragedies like this one from unfolding undetected for years. Christine Smith deserved to live out her years in peace, surrounded by the family she trusted. Her story, though marked by tragedy, ultimately reached a measure of accountability through the dedicated work of investigators who refused to let her case fade into the desert silence. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 5. Hend Karim Bustami. October 2006, 2022. Clark County, Nevada. In the quiet residential streets of South Las Vegas, homes stand close together, the kind of neighborhood where families have lived for years, where neighbors recognize each other's cars in the driveway and children play within earshot of open windows. It was in one of these homes, on an otherwise unremarkable evening in late October of 2022, that a mother and daughter's relationship reached an ending no one in that neighborhood could have anticipated. Afaf Hussanen was 61 years old, a woman who had spent decades building a life for her family, sharing her home with her adult daughter, Hend Karim Bustami. Like many households, theirs had its share of tension, the kind of friction that exists in nearly every long-term relationship between a parent and a grown child still living under the same roof. But on this particular night, whatever disagreement unfolded between mother and daughter escalated far beyond anything ordinary. According to investigators, an argument between Afaf and her daughter grew increasingly intense, reaching a boiling point that neither woman could pull back from. In the chaos of the confrontation, a glass table inside the home became a weapon, used against Afaf in a moment of overwhelming violence. What followed compounded the tragedy further, as the shattered remains of that same table were used to inflict additional harm, injuries so severe that investigators later described the scene as one of the most disturbing they had encountered in South Las Vegas in recent memory. By the time the violence inside that home came to an end, Afaf Hussanen had lost her life, a mother taken by the very hand she had raised. What happened next added another layer of shock to an already devastating case. Rather than attempting to conceal what had occurred, Bustami herself placed a call to emergency services, informing dispatchers of what had just taken place inside her home. But instead of remaining at the scene to cooperate fully with the responding officers, she fled the residence, driving in the direction of the California state line, seemingly attempting to put as much distance as possible between herself and the home where her mother now lay. Nevada Highway Patrol troopers, alerted to the unfolding situation, located Bustami's vehicle during her attempted flight. When troopers approached, they found her covered in blood, a haunting visual that would later become a defining image of the case in local and national coverage. She was taken into custody without further incident, and the investigation into what had happened inside that South Las Vegas home began in full. As the case developed, Bustami's name spread far beyond the borders of Nevada, driven largely by an unrelated moment from an earlier arrest that had circulated widely online. During that previous encounter with law enforcement, Bustami had been recorded telling officers with startling confidence that she was simply too attractive to be taken into custody. The clip took on a life of its own across social media platforms, transforming Bustami into a subject of widespread public fascination long before many people even understood the gravity of the case now connected to her name. For investigators and prosecutors working to bring justice for Afaf Hussanen, this wave of online attention created an unusual challenge, as the seriousness of a mother's death competed for public attention with a viral clip that reduced a devastating tragedy to entertainment. As the legal process moved forward, questions surrounding Bustami's mental state became a central part of the proceedings. Evaluations conducted during the pretrial process raised significant concerns among mental health professionals regarding her psychological condition at the time of the incident. These findings ultimately shaped the direction the case would take. Rather than proceeding to a full jury trial, Bustami entered a plea that reflected these underlying mental health concerns. She pleaded guilty but mentally ill to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon, a legal designation that acknowledges her responsibility for the outcome while also formally recognizing the mental health evaluations conducted throughout the case. The court sentenced her to a term of 15 years to life in prison, a sentence structured to account for both the severity of the loss and the psychological factors identified throughout the legal process. For the family and loved ones of Afaf Hussanen, the sentencing offered a form of resolution, even as it opened up broader, more complicated conversations about the intersection of mental health and violence within families. Cases like this one highlight the critical importance of accessible mental health resources for families navigating unstable or escalating situations at home. Organizations such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, known as NAMI, provide support, education and crisis resources for families concerned about a loved one's mental health, offering guidance long before a situation reaches a point of no return. Afaf Hussanan deserved to spend her later years in peace within the home she built for her family. Her story stands as a powerful reminder of how quickly family conflict can spiral into catastrophe, and why early intervention and mental health support remain such vital tools in preventing tragedies like hers from happening to other families. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 6, Allysandra Blea, August 23, 2025, Clark County, Nevada. Friendship, at its best, is built on trust, the kind of trust that allows people to let their guard down completely in each other's company. On a late summer night in Las Vegas, a small group of friends gathered together, sharing drinks, laughter, and the easy comfort of people who had known each other long enough to feel safe. Among them was 23-year-old Mark Santiago Gorn, a photographer known among his friends for his creative eye and his willingness to capture the small, memorable moments of everyday life. By the end of that night, the trust shared among that small circle of friends would be shattered forever. As the evening wore on, the group had been drinking heavily, the kind of relaxed, unguarded atmosphere that often accompanies a casual night among friends. At some point, the gathering shifted towards something far less casual. Someone in the group produced a firearm, and rather than treating the weapon with the seriousness it demanded, the group began posing for photographs with it, treating a genuinely dangerous object as though it were nothing more than a prop for a few memorable pictures. Mark, ever the photographer, picked up his camera to capture the moment, positioning himself to document his friend Allysandra Blea as she held the firearm and posed for the shot. What should have remained a reckless but harmless lapse in judgment turned catastrophic in an instant. As Mark focused on capturing the image, the firearm discharged. Mark was struck by the gunfire, and despite the desperate efforts of those around him, he did not survive his injuries. In the aftermath of that single, irreversible moment, investigators moved quickly to understand exactly what had happened and why. What they uncovered went far beyond a simple accident involving an improperly handled firearm. As detectives began reviewing Blea's digital history, including her social media activity and personal messages, a deeply concerning pattern began to emerge. Investigators discovered a series of messages and posts that revealed what they described as an intense fixation on firearms, one that extended well beyond typical interest or casual familiarity with guns. Among the most alarming discoveries were messages in which Blea had written about wanting to shoot people with real firearms and escape any consequences for doing so. For investigators, these prior statements transformed the case from a tragic accident into something requiring far more serious scrutiny, raising uncomfortable questions about intent, recklessness, and the disturbing preoccupation that had apparently existed in Blea's mind well before that fatal night. The investigation into Mark's death moved through the legal system for nearly a year, a period during which prosecutors weighed the full weight of the evidence against the possibility of taking the case to trial on an open murder charge. Ultimately, both sides reached a resolution through a negotiated plea agreement. Rather than proceeding to trial, where the outcome remained uncertain for both the prosecution and the defense, Blea agreed to plead guilty to first-degree kidnapping and involuntary manslaughter, accepting responsibility for the fatal outcome of that night, while avoiding the harsher possibility of an open murder conviction. On July the 28th, 2026, nearly a full year after the incident that ended Mark Gorn's life, Blea stood before a Clark County judge for her formal sentencing. During the emotional hearing, Mark's mother addressed the court directly, describing the profound bond she shared with her only child and the immeasurable void his absence had left in her life. The judge ultimately sentenced Blea to a term of 5 years to life in prison, a sentence reflecting both the severity of the loss and the negotiated terms both sides had agreed upon prior to sentencing. For Mark's family and the wider community of friends who once considered Blea one of their own, the case serves as a devastating reminder of the real, irreversible consequences that can follow when firearms are treated carelessly, even among people who consider themselves close friends. Firearm safety organizations across Nevada, including local chapters focused on responsible gun ownership, continued to emphasize a simple but critical message. Every firearm should be treated as though it is loaded at all times, regardless of the setting or the familiarity between the people present. This single principle, if followed, can prevent tragedies like the one that took Mark Gaughan's life far too soon. Mark Gaughan was known for the way he saw the world through his camera lens, capturing moments most people would never think twice about. His story reminds us that safety, awareness, and respect around firearms are not optional courtesies among friends, but life or death necessities that can never be treated lightly. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 7. Amy Bessey, November 14th, 2012. Clark County, Nevada. Interstate 15 stretches through the Nevada desert like a lifeline connecting Las Vegas to the rest of the country, a road traveled by thousands of vehicles every single day, carrying commuters, truckers, and families toward destinations near and far. For Robert Bessey, that highway was simply part of his daily routine, an unremarkable stretch of asphalt he had driven countless times before. On the night of November the 14th, 2012, that same stretch of highway became the setting for an ambush so calculated, so cold in its planning, that it would leave investigators struggling to comprehend the depths of betrayal behind it. At the center of this plot was Amy Bessey, a woman whose personal life had already taken a deeply troubling turn in the months leading up to that night. Bessey was estranged from her husband, Robert, their marriage having deteriorated to the point of separation. But rather than pursuing the difficult, lawful path toward divorce, Bessey allegedly turned toward something far darker, orchestrating a plan that would ultimately involve members of her own family in an act of unimaginable betrayal. Investigators would later reveal one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Bessey had begun a secret romantic relationship with her own adopted son, Michael Bessey, a young man of 21 years old at the time. This relationship, prosecutors argued, became the emotional foundation Bessey used to manipulate Michael into participating in the plot against his own adoptive father. Alongside Michael, Bessey also drew in her brother, Richard Pearson, a man with a previous criminal history, completing the small circle of people she would ultimately convince to help carry out her plan. On the night in question, Michael and Richard drove out onto Interstate 15, heading north from Las Vegas, tracking Robert's vehicle as he made his way along the same familiar route he traveled regularly. As they pulled alongside Robert's car at high speed, one of the two men opened fire, striking Robert in the neck as vehicles sped down the highway at speeds that left virtually no margin for error. What followed was, by any measure, a remarkable act of survival. Despite the severity of his injury, Robert Bessey maintained enough control of his vehicle to avoid a catastrophic crash, and, in a moment that would later be described by investigators as nothing short of miraculous, managed to place a call to emergency services himself, providing crucial details that would help law enforcement begin piecing together exactly what had just happened to him on that stretch of highway. Robert's survival became the single most important factor in the case that followed. Rather than a scene investigators would need to reconstruct entirely from forensic evidence and second-hand accounts, they now had a living witness, a man who had experienced the ambush firsthand and could speak directly to what had happened. As Robert recovered from his injuries, he provided investigators with details that helped steer the investigation directly toward his estranged wife. As detectives began examining the relationships surrounding Robert and Amy's marriage, the disturbing truth of Amy's relationship with her own adopted son came into focus, along with the involvement of her brother, Richard. Prosecutors built a case around the highly unusual family dynamics at play, presenting evidence that framed the attack not as a spontaneous act of violence, but as a methodically planned assassination attempt, designed specifically around a substantial financial incentive. At the heart of Bessey's motivation, prosecutors argued, sat a life insurance policy valued at $250,000, a policy that would have paid out directly to Amy had Robert not survived the attack on the highway that night. The case proceeded to a jury trial where prosecutors laid out the full scope of the conspiracy, the relationships involved, and the financial motive driving the entire plan. In late 2013, the jury returned its verdict, convicting Amy Bessey on all counts related to the conspiracy and the attack against her husband. The court sentenced her to a term of 14 to 44 years in prison. Her co-defendants, including her son Michael and her brother Richard, also received their own prison sentences for their roles in carrying out the plan. For Robert Bessey, survival came at a tremendous physical and emotional cost, forced to reconcile not only with a life-threatening injury, but with the devastating knowledge that his own wife and members of his own family had conspired to end his life. His story stands as a testament to resilience in the face of the most personal kind of betrayal imaginable, and a reminder of how domestic conflict, left to fester without intervention, can escalate to levels few could ever anticipate. Families navigating high-conflict separations are encouraged to seek support through community mediation services and domestic relations resources available throughout Nevada, which aim to help families resolve disputes through lawful, safe channels long before tensions reach a breaking point. Robert Bessey's survival, against extraordinary odds, ultimately became the very reason justice was possible in this case, a rare thread of hope woven through an otherwise harrowing story of family betrayal. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 8. Alivia Bree Thrift. January 22, 2025 through March 24, 2026. Clark County, Nevada. Before we continue into this next case, we want to note that this particular story involves the loss of a very young child, and it remains an active, ongoing legal matter. Every detail presented here reflects only what has been alleged by prosecutors and outlined in the indictment. Nothing in this case has been proven in a court of law, and the individual involved has entered a plea of not guilty. We share this story not to render judgment ahead of a trial, but to bring awareness to the warning signs that community members, medical professionals and family members can watch for in hopes of protecting other children in the future. In the city of Henderson, Nevada, a quiet community just outside the bright lights of Las Vegas, a young mother named Alivia Bree Thrift welcomed a baby girl into the world. A child she named Evangelina. For the first months of Evangelina's short life, she existed largely outside the awareness of the wider community, known only to the small circle of family and acquaintances who moved in and out of her mother's orbit. According to the allegations outlined in the indictment, over a period spanning more than a year, between January of 2025 and March of 2026, Evangelina was allegedly denied the basic nourishment and medical attention every child deserves. Prosecutors allege that during this extended period, the toddler was left in conditions that investigators would later describe as deeply neglectful, conditions no child should ever have to endure. By the time Evangelina's brief life came to an end on March the 24th, 2026, medical examiners determined that her body weighed only 9 pounds, a weight investigators noted was consistent with an infant far younger than her actual age. The Clark County Coroner's Office reviewed the findings and ultimately classified her death as a homicide caused by prolonged malnutrition. According to prosecutors, evidence gathered during the investigation, including medical assessments of Evangelina's condition at the time of her death, suggested a pattern of sustained severe neglect rather than a sudden or accidental event. Prosecutors have stated that family members had, at various points, encouraged Evangelina's mother to seek medical care for the child, concerns that, according to the indictment, went unaddressed. Following an extensive investigation by local law enforcement, a grand jury reviewed the evidence presented and returned an indictment against Alivia Bree Thrift, charging her with 1 count of murder and 1 count of child abuse, neglect, or endangerment resulting in substantial bodily harm. On July the 23rd, 2026, Thrift appeared before a Clark County judge and entered a plea of not guilty to both charges. She remains in custody without bail as the case proceeds through the legal system, with her trial currently scheduled for March the 22nd, 2027. Until that trial concludes, every allegation outlined in this case remains just that, an allegation, and Thrift is entitled to the presumption of innocence guaranteed to every individual facing criminal charges in the United States justice system. Cases involving the well-being of infants and toddlers underscore the critical importance of community vigilance, particularly for young children who are entirely dependent on the adults around them and unable to advocate for their own needs. Nevada's Child Protective Services maintains a 24-hour hotline for anyone with concerns about a child's safety or well-being, and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline offers confidential support and guidance for anyone, anywhere in the country, who suspects a child may be at risk. If you ever have concerns about a child's welfare, reaching out to these resources could make the difference in that child's life. Evangelina Thrift lived only a short time, but her story has already begun prompting difficult, necessary conversations about the responsibility every community carries in protecting its most vulnerable members. As this case continues to move through the legal process, we will continue to follow it, and we remain committed to honoring Evangelina's memory with the dignity and care her brief life deserves. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 9. Sandy Murphy. September 17th, 1998. Clark County, Nevada. There are cases that fade quietly into the archives of local news, and then there are cases that become woven permanently into the identity of a city. In Las Vegas, a town built on glamour, fortune, and larger-than-life personalities, few stories captured the public imagination quite like the one surrounding Sandy Murphy and the death of casino heir Ted Binion. It is a story that has everything: wealth beyond ordinary comprehension, buried treasure hidden in the desert, forbidden romance, and a courtroom drama that captivated the entire nation. To understand this case, one must first understand Ted Binion himself, a man born into one of the most recognizable names in Las Vegas gaming history. As the son of a legendary casino family, Ted grew up surrounded by extraordinary wealth, eventually building his own fortune and reputation within the industry his family had helped shape. But wealth, as this case would ultimately reveal, does not guarantee safety, and it does not guarantee loyalty from those closest to you. Sandy Murphy entered Ted's life during a period when her own career had involved dancing at one of the many entertainment venues that line the outskirts of the Las Vegas Strip. Their relationship developed quickly, and before long, Sandy had moved into Ted's lavish estate, becoming a fixture in his day-to-day life and, according to those close to him, a significant influence over his personal affairs. To the outside world, they appeared to be a couple enjoying the fruits of Ted's family fortune together. But beneath the surface, a far more complicated and dangerous situation was quietly taking shape. According to prosecutors, Sandy had begun a secret relationship with a man named Rick Tabish, a relationship she carefully concealed from Ted even as she continued living under his roof and benefiting from his considerable resources. Investigators would later argue that this secret relationship became the foundation for a chilling plan, one motivated not by love, but by the staggering scale of Ted Binion's personal fortune. On September the 17th, 1998, Ted Binion's life came to an end inside his own Las Vegas estate. Prosecutors alleged that Sandy and Rick worked together to force a combination of heroin and Xanax into Ted's system, a lethal cocktail intended to look, at first glance, like a tragic accident or a voluntary overdose. When that combination proved insufficient on its own, prosecutors argued, additional measures were taken to ensure Ted did not survive the night actions that investigators later described as calculated and deliberate, rather than the product of any accident. What made this case so extraordinary, beyond the celebrity status of the victim, was the almost unbelievable detail uncovered during the investigation. Buried deep within the Nevada desert, Ted Binion had constructed an elaborate underground vault, one used to store an enormous private fortune of silver bullion, hidden away from banks, business partners, and apparently from Sandy herself. Investigators would later reveal that in the days surrounding Ted's death, an attempt had been made to access and remove this buried treasure, a detail that added an almost cinematic layer to an already sensational case. The investigation that followed captured headlines not just locally, but across the entire country. Detectives meticulously built their case, piecing together toxicology reports, witness testimony, and financial records that painted a damning picture of two people motivated by unimaginable greed. In 2000, a jury reviewed the evidence and convicted Sandy Murphy of murder in connection with Ted Binion's death. But the story did not end there. Sandy's legal team pursued an appeal, arguing that errors had occurred during the original trial that warranted a complete retrial of the case. Remarkably, that appeal succeeded, and in a dramatic turn of events, the case returned to court in 2004 for an entirely new trial. This second trial brought the case back into the national spotlight, as prosecutors and defense attorneys once again presented dueling narratives to a new jury. This time, the outcome shifted dramatically. The jury acquitted Sandy Murphy of the murder charges that had defined the case from the very beginning. She was not, however, cleared entirely. The jury did convict her on lesser charges connected to grand larceny, related to the attempted removal of Ted's buried fortune following his death. The Binion case remains, to this day, one of the most studied and debated true crime stories to emerge from Nevada, a case that continues to generate discussion about the burden of proof required in the American justice system, and the complicated reality that a jury's decision, even one reached after careful deliberation, does not always deliver the singular, satisfying resolution the public often hopes for. For those who knew Ted Binion, his death represented the loss of a complicated man who had built his own path within an already legendary family name, someone whose story ultimately became inseparable from the very fortune that surrounded him in life and in death. Financial exploitation of individuals, particularly within romantic relationships involving significant wealth disparities, remains a serious and often underreported issue. Organizations focused on elder and financial abuse awareness continue to encourage families to remain alert to sudden changes in a loved one's estate planning, especially when a new romantic partner becomes closely involved in financial decision-making. Ted Binion's story endures not simply because of the buried silver or the dramatic courtroom reversals, but because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, wealth, and the lengths some people are willing to go to acquire what was never truly theirs to take. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 10. Kassandra Orozco. July 18th, 2026. Clark County, Nevada. Before we begin this final case, it's important to note that this story is still unfolding within the legal system, and it involves a defendant who was a minor at the time of the alleged offense, though she has since been ordered to face these charges as an adult. Every detail shared here reflects only what has been alleged in arrest reports and court filings. No conviction has occurred, and the individual involved is entitled to the presumption of innocence throughout these ongoing proceedings. In the early morning hours of July the 18th, 2026, residents near Hollywood Regional Park in East Las Vegas woke to the kind of call no neighborhood ever wants to receive. Emergency dispatchers had been alerted to reports of an unresponsive man lying on the ground near South Hollywood Boulevard. Responding officers arrived to find 18-year-old Carlos Valenzuela suffering from a gunshot wound. Despite the efforts of medical personnel who arrived on scene, Carlos did not survive. In the days that followed, investigators worked to reconstruct exactly what had led to this quiet residential area becoming the scene of a homicide investigation. Detectives began by examining Carlos's recent relationships and associations, uncovering a complicated web of personal history and alleged gang affiliation that painted a much more layered picture than a simple random encounter. According to arrest reports, Carlos had previously been in a relationship with a young woman named Kassandra Orozco, a relationship that had ended but apparently left behind unresolved tension between the two. Investigators allege that on the night before the shooting, Kassandra reached out to Carlos, expressing interest in reconnecting with him. A message that, according to the arrest report, set the stage for what would happen next. Detectives allege that Kassandra was not acting alone. Her cousin, 19-year-old Jaden Torres, was allegedly drawn into the plan as well. According to investigators, Carlos was affiliated with one gang, while Jaden was allegedly connected to a rival group, a dynamic that prosecutors believe added an additional layer of motive beyond the personal history between Kassandra and Carlos. Using cell phone location data, digital payment records, and witness interviews, including accounts from a juvenile who was reportedly present in the vehicle that night, investigators allege that Kassandra and Jaden coordinated a plan to lure Carlos to a secluded area near the park under the pretense of reconciliation. According to the arrest report, once Carlos arrived at the location, gunfire broke out, ultimately resulting in his death. In the days following the shooting, investigators worked methodically to identify those responsible. On July the 22nd, Jaden Torres was taken into custody, facing charges of open murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. 2 days later, on July the 24th, detectives arrested Kassandra Orozco as well, charging her with the same 3 offenses. Given the severity of the allegations, prosecutors moved to have Kassandra's case transferred out of the juvenile justice system and into adult court, a request that was ultimately granted. Both Kassandra and Jaden made their initial court appearances at the Regional Justice Center, where they were formally arraigned and ordered held without bail, while the case against them continues to develop. As of this recording, both defendants remain in custody at the Clark County Detention Center awaiting further proceedings, including preliminary hearings that will determine how the case moves forward. This case, more than any other featured in this documentary, illustrates a painful and increasingly common reality across the country: the entanglement of young people in cycles of gang rivalry and retaliatory violence, often before they are old enough to fully grasp the permanence of the decisions being made around them. Regardless of the outcome of this case, the loss of 18-year-old Carlos Valenzuela represents a young life cut short, and the involvement of a 16-year-old in such serious allegations raises difficult questions about intervention, mentorship, and the resources available to young people at risk of being pulled into dangerous situations. Community organizations across Clark County, including local gang intervention and youth mentorship programs, continue working to provide at-risk teenagers with alternative paths forward, offering mentorship, counseling, and safe spaces designed to interrupt cycles of violence before they claim more young lives. If you are a parent or community member concerned about a young person's involvement in risky associations, reaching out to local youth services can be an important first step toward change. As this case continues to move through the courts, we will remain committed to following it with the same care and accuracy we've applied throughout this documentary, honoring Carlos Valenzuela's memory, while allowing the legal process to run its full course. Don't forget to like and subscribe. That brings us to the end of today's 10 cases. Each one a reminder that the most devastating betrayals often come from the people we trust the most. A spouse, a daughter, a friend, a mother. From a military garage in Las Vegas to a buried fortune of silver in the Nevada desert, these stories span decades, but they share a common thread. Behind every case number is a real person who deserved so much more than the ending they were given. We started this series with a simple goal: to tell these stories with the respect and the accuracy they deserve, without losing sight of the fact that real families are still living with the consequences of everything you just heard. Two of the cases we covered today, the loss of young Evangelina Thrift and the shooting of Carlos Valenzuela, are still working their way through the Nevada court system as we release this video. We'll continue to follow both of those cases and bring you updates as they develop. If today's documentary kept you gripped from case 1 all the way to case 10, that's exactly what Cold Case Hour is here to do, and there's a lot more where this came from. We've got deep dives into cases from across the entire country, and we're just getting started on Nevada. So before you go, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you made it to the end, and let us know in the comments which of these 10 cases stuck with you the most. Was it Michelle Paet's military ambush, Sandy Murphy's buried treasure, or Amy Bessey's highway sniper plot? We read every comment, and we'll see you in the next one. This has been Cold Case Hour. Stay safe out there.